Back live with you tonight here on In Focus. Take back to the closing of the BRICS summit. South Africa's ambassador to Brazil, Vusi Mavimbela, says that the BRICS expansion proved a lot of naysayers wrong. He made the comments as the bloc's 15th summit came to a close this evening at the Sandton Convention Centre. Newzroom Afrika's business editor Xolani Mbanjwa spoke to the ambassador earlier.
The 15th BRICS Summit at the Sandton Convention Centre is still underway here on day 3 as the eyes of the world are focused on South Africa for particularly this week. As President Cyril Ramaphosa has read the declaration of this 15th BRICS Summit, it is important to find out from other leaders from South Africa as to how they view this particular summit. I am joined now by South Africa's ambassador to Brazil, one of the first countries to join BRICS, and that is Mr. Vusi Mavimbela, who is also an author, having recently authored the book Time is Not the Measure. He joins me now to actually give his perspective on the 15th BRICS Summit. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time today. I would like to start here, Mr. Mavimbela, about your impressions, having seen the deliberations here and the declaration. What are the highlights for you as far as the success of the 15th BRICS Summit is concerned?
You know, leading up to this summit, there was a lot of talk about some countries being against expansion. There was a lot of talk about Brazil in particular being against expansion. And I've always been saying that's not the vibe that I get sitting in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. Is that Brazil is concerned about the criteria, not so much about expansion itself. So the highlight for me is that, one, we have been proven correct, that Brazil was not against expansion. And the fact that this summit has achieved this expansion, I think for me is the highlight, because the reality is that for BRICS to continue to grow and make the impact that we all want it to make on international affairs, it will have to pull in some like-minded countries, the countries that can add to the value of the summit and the organization itself, but also countries that are going to bring in resources that are going to be very helpful in achieving what we want to achieve, all of us, that is the development of the South.
What do you think from the highlights, from what has been achieved thus far, is going to be the outlook? What work are you going to be focused on starting today? Because you sit in a very important position as a BRICS member country, an ambassador in a BRICS member country.
You know, luckily is that we have the administration that we have in Brazil right now that is very committed to BRICS, is committed to IPSA. As you know, we also belong to IPSA, South Africa, Brazil, and India. And President Lula has said that in his own view, we need to revive IPSA, because IPSA itself needs to be a very strong voice, even within BRICS. That within IPSA, there are commonalities between our three countries, which we can iron out, and by the time we come to the broader forum, which is now BRICS, that is expanded, actually we come with a common voice, and then we can make the greatest impact there.
Let's talk about that particular connectivity and more engagement that the Brazilian President Lula da Silva spoke about. We heard him talking about in his opening address, talking about how Brazil needs to reignite its relationship not only with South Africa but the rest of Africa. And come to think of it, his predecessor, Bolsonaro, was never once in Africa during his entire term as the president of Brazil. Just to go back, because you were already ambassador in Brazil in the administration of Bolsonaro, it seems things were different then. He was not taking African nations seriously. How was it to actually sell South Africa's story there and engage on a diplomatic level with the Brazilian under that administration?
I must say that to a very large extent, thanks to the leadership of President Lula and his party, the Workers' Party, and of course before him, the process had already started in a tentative way with the former President Cardoso, that is to affirm Afro-Brazilians, black people in Brazil. You know, as a consequence of that, census after census in Brazil, more and more people declare themselves as black, as Afro-Brazilian. That number has been increasing, and the reality why it has been increasing is because there is now affirmative action for black people. They know they can benefit. But apart from that is the stigma that came with slavery, where black people in Brazil continued and still continue to a very large extent to be marginalized, to be looked down upon. So for a black person or a person of mixed race, they were afraid to say they are actually black and they are Afro-Brazilians, because they thought there would be better benefits in being saying they are white, and they'll be disadvantaged if they say they are black. But with President Lula's articulation of this issue of blackness and the need to affirm blackness, more and more black people, every other census, the number. The last number that is now from the last census is that 54 to 55% of Brazilians are actually Africans. They actually originate from Africa. They actually have got African blood. And that is a big thing. You see, another thing, because of this number that I'm talking about 54, 55%, this issue is not just a foreign policy to Lula, it's also a domestic policy. So his embrace of the African continent is actually an extension of his domestic policy of affirming black people. So it's a huge black constituency that votes for him, that votes for his party. And that constituency wants connectivity with the African continent. So you can see that these things, the domestic policy, in as far as racial articulation is concerned, and the foreign policy actually link. It's one process, from the domestic to the foreign, and from the foreign to the domestic. And of course, that process of articulation and affirming Afro-Brazilians was kind of disrupted to a certain extent in the past 4 to 5 years.
Under Bolsonaro's presidency.
During that administration. There was a kind of a halt on a lot of things. And in fact, some of the processes were reversed. So President Lula has come back to say, no, we are going back where I left, and we are going to affirm black people, we are going to embrace Africa, we are going to ensure that there's this closer connectivity, not only with Africa, but also south to south.
Ambassador, let's talk about something that is quite important as well, and that is climate change and the energy transition. When you look at international policy, international climate change policy, it calls for African countries like South Africa to limit mining resources such as coal. That is something that is quite important because of our economy. It is the same thing for the other African countries as well. But the strange thing, and one argument that African leaders are making, is that Africa is responsible for less than 3% of carbon emissions. So we shouldn't force the climate change policies on African countries. What is your take in terms of how the international policy is disadvantaging or not African countries who are not as big polluters as the West and the East and other regions of the world?
Yeah, of course, it's a very tricky issue. The reality is that all of us should be and are concerned about climate change. But there should be a balanced approach. There should be an equitable approach to how we solve this problem. So our contributions as the African continent, South Africa being part of the African continent, is that it should be understood that we are still developing countries. We'll still need some of these resources for us to advance and reach to the same level that the developing countries are. So there should be this equitable understanding of where we are. So in as much as they are calling on this, but I think the responsibility lies more with them in terms of helping us to go through this process. And the problem is that they are not really coming to the table. I mean, the resources that they declare are not coming as quickly as they should. They are not as comprehensive as they should. But apart from anything, it's a very complicated and complex matter. I mean, if you talk about shutting down coal mines in South Africa, we are talking about shutting down the livelihood of so many people. And it's not like just switching a button and then things happen. It's a whole process. If we talk about the developing countries saying that they are dedicating resources, does it go to the extent of taking care of the people that are going to be sidelined by the process? It doesn't, to a very large extent. So what they've committed actually is minimal in terms of the complexity and the immensity of the things that need to be done to carry the whole communities into the future.
What do you think? How do you think the African countries should respond to these particular calls for, fossil fuels to be ditched and thrown away? What do you think should be happening from the African continent, that perspective? Because it is a tricky thing when you have powerful Western nations calling on the African continent to do 1, 2, 3. We haven't been united as the African continent when it comes to policy issues such as this.
You know, one thing good about this summit, this BRICS summit, is that we are expanding the reach and the power of the South, of the developing countries, and of Africa as such. You know, I am in Brazil now. You know, in Brazil, they don't have coal. So they don't have the problem that we have. And as a result, because they don't have coal, their energy mix is clean to a very large extent. They depend on hydro, they depend on renewables, they depend on biofuels and so on. And they've got plenty of it. And they've got advanced technology because they never had to rely on coal. They had to rely on these other sources of energy. So one thing good for us is that countries like Brazil coming into BRICS and coming into the collaboration by the South actually come with advanced technology and huge resources that can actually help us to move forward on this issue. Apart from the pressure from the West, but even amongst ourselves in the South. You see, right now, you know, together with the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, that department asked us as ambassadors to select companies from Brazil. Can you select companies that we can invite to this BRICS? Companies that can have an impact in terms of investment in South Africa or in terms of exporting and importing South African goods into Brazil. Some of them are here. And some of them are in the biofuel industry and quite advanced companies. And they are here, they want to invest here because they are aware we are facing these challenges of the just transition, of load shedding and so on. So these are some of the things. Already there you see collaboration between the developing countries. Not just Africa fighting alone, but let's broaden our efforts to take ourselves out of this quagmire.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time here at the 15th BRICS Summit. That is Ambassador Vusi Mavimbela, South Africa's ambassador to Brazil. A lot that are in synergies between the two countries. And of course, the President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, extending a hand, unlike his predecessor, saying he wants a much more deeper relationship between Brazil and the rest of Africa continent, something that we haven't seen, at least in the previous administration. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Xolani Mbanjwa at the Sandton Convention Centre in Johannesburg.